Technical interviews trigger a lot of anxiety, especially when you're asked to write code on the spot. But as an experienced hiring manager, I want to talk today about not only why coding challenges are necessary as part of the interview process, but if you stick around towards the end, I'm going to give you the details of an interview challenge that I used for many years that had a 90% failure rate for mid and senior level developers. So one of the reasons why coding challenges are a necessary part of the interview process is because hiring the wrong developer is really expensive. Developers make premium salaries, and I don't care if you're an entry-level, mid, or senior developer, when you join a new team, there is a period where you are not going to be productive. You have to learn the tools. You have to learn the code base. You might have to learn about the domain of the company. And it can take 3 to 6 months for the average developer to get up to speed and start producing. So that means if you hire a bad developer, there's a 3 to 6 month grace period where you're trying to figure out if it's them or they're just coming along slowly. And if it is them, you may have to go through the performance improvement process. And that can take months longer before you're actually able to show the person the door. So in the worst case, you can be out 12 months of productivity, 12 months of salary, and heaven forbid that they produced what we call negative work, which is where their code was so bad that it's going to have to be redone by somebody else on your team. And then you have all the costs involved in starting the hiring process over, because hiring somebody is expensive. You have to factor in all the salaries of all the team members that have to participate in the interviews. You have to factor in recruiting fees and advertising fees and the loss of productivity. What does it cost your company to not be producing work as quickly as they would like? All of these things add up, so hiring the wrong developer is often a 6-figure mistake. The other factor in favor of coding tests in the interview process is that it's relatively easy to sit down and memorize things and learn to talk like a programmer without being able to write actual code. And that's the same for almost any vocation. I mean, I could study up and I could talk like a carpenter, but I do not have carpenter skills. And the minute somebody sat me down and asked me to use carpenter's tools and produce a carpenter thing, I would fail. And this is one of the reasons why I don't ask a lot of data structures and algorithms questions in my interview. As an educator, I would like to call out to Bloom's taxonomy. And part of data structures and algorithms is memorizing all the different types of problems and how they generally work. And all that really teaches you is the bottom part of the hierarchy. Can you memorize and regurgitate code on command? And I don't find that to be very useful or predictive of the future success of a developer, so I tended to avoid those questions. But to be fair, I do understand asking those questions if you're at a company on a team that builds systems at scale, where that knowledge of data structures and algorithms is something you use on the job. But the fact of the matter is, most developer jobs are working for corporate enterprises who are not using those things in their day-to-day jobs. So I needed to create my own programming challenge. And at this point, I want to pull up an old blog post from the Coding Horror blog. And basically what the author and others observed, and that I verified as well, is that if you were looking to weed out the posers, you don't need an overly complicated coding test. In fact, many hiring managers reported that the FizzBuzz challenge was beyond even some experienced professional developers, which is just crazy to me. And if you're unfamiliar, let me quickly cover FizzBuzz. It's a simple programming exercise where you print out the numbers from 1 to 100. And if the number is a factor of 3, you print the word fizz instead of the number. And if the number is a factor of 5, you print the word buzz instead of the number. And if it's a factor of both 3 and 5, you print FizzBuzz. And this is depending on the language. I mean, you can write this in less than 20-25 lines of code. It's pretty simple and straightforward. But it does test that you understand loops and conditions and how to check for factors in your language. So even though it's a simple problem, it does cover some basic coding concepts, which is why posers weren't able to pass it. The whole idea is that people who are poor programmers struggle at simple problems. You don't need something overly complex to flush them out. Now, as an aside here, FizzBuzz became so notorious as a weed out problem when I was younger that I have included it in all of my Skill Foundry courses and bootcamp courses ever since then, because I never want one of my students to get embarrassed like that in the interview. So on to my coding test. First, I had to set some criteria. And number 1, it had to mimic the real developer environment. So I set up a laptop, I put all the developer tools on it, and I left the internet connection open. Yes, I let people use the internet during the interview because real developers look things up all the time. Number 2, it had to actually measure skills that my development team used on a day-to-day basis. In this case, the company we worked for had a lot of internal applications that interacted with relational databases, and the applications were there to assist with loading, saving, and transforming data from the customers and the business processes. Number 3, I wanted to be respectful of the candidate's time, which meant I needed to time box the solution. And I said at the upper end, I wanted to put a limit of 2 hours. And I wanted the project to be achievable within 26 minutes by somebody who knew what they were doing. And I tested this by creating several versions of the coding test and giving them to the members of my team. And the one I chose, the average solving time on my team was 26 minutes. And I figured with all the tools and the ability to ask questions and the ability to use the internet, that 26 minutes to 2 hours was more than enough time for somebody that was rusty or ran into something that they were unfamiliar with, that they would have time to ask some questions and do some light research. Now it's time to reveal the coding challenge. So on the laptop, I installed a database, and that database had 4 tables that you can see here. We had customer, we had invoice, we had payment, and we had payment invoice. And the challenge was to use any language or technique that you want. But what you had to do was take in a payment for a customer and then process that payment. And by processing the payment, I mean looping through the invoices that had balances due associated with that customer and pay in money out of the payment until you run out of payment or you run out of invoices. And this is a standard task for most billing systems. And overall, the solution was less than 100 lines of code. In fact, much less than 100 lines of code. And the result of this test was a 90% failure rate among mid and senior developers that made it that far into the interview process. And this means they got past the verbal phone screening where they just talked about developer things. They could all talk like developers, but 90% of them, when sit down in front of a simple problem and a blank screen, were unable to craft a solution in 2 hours. And I'm talking Fortune 500 software developers who were commanding 6-figure salaries that couldn't do this. And I had one gentleman in particular who stands out in my memory because I had high hopes for him. Great resume, tailored to the job position. Comes in, sits down at the coding test, sits there for 2 hours, does not ask any questions, and gets up at the end of the 2 hours and has not written a single line of code. Now, most people, when they sat down and they realized they couldn't do it for whatever reason, they would get up in 10, 15, 20 minutes and excuse themselves from the interview. But this gentleman in particular sat there for 2 hours and didn't talk to anybody. And that was just astonishing to me. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were unemployable, because they were working for a Fortune 500 company at the time. And here's kind of how this happens to people. You see, in a lot of larger established companies, you get put on a team that has a very specific focus. Like if you're working for an insurance company, you might be put on the claims processing engine. And you can sit in that role for 5 or 10 years and only work on that one thing and never start anything new. You're just adjusting and maintaining what is already there. And that's great. If you're going to sit there for 5 or 10 years, you're making good pay, you have a good life. But from a skills standpoint, that kind of narrow focus really hurts you if you try to step out into other companies, especially smaller companies and smaller teams where you're going to be asked to be more agile and wear a lot more hats. And the company I was hiring for fell into that small category. It was a startup. We had about 150 people total in the company, and my team was about 20 people in total across QA, networking, and the developers. So we had to be really agile, and we had to wear a lot of hats. So part of my coding test, having them start from scratch, read a spec, and craft a solution, is because I was looking for people who were wheels, not boxes. And this is something when I'm training large companies and helping them with their interview process and things like that, putting people into the categories of wheels and boxes is really useful. So let me explain. If somebody is a wheel, you can start them in motion, and you can push a wheel and it might wobble or go a little bit side to side, but you can adjust it. But mostly that wheel is going to keep forward momentum on its own. A box, on the other hand, you have to push on. And when you stop pushing, the box stops. And when you're in a small team environment, nobody has time to craft perfect specifications. And nobody has time to sit around and hold somebody's hand and explain to them in detail every part of the process. And nobody has time to solve your problems for you. You have to be innovative. You have to be able to do your own research, and you have to be able to self-motivate. And having a coding test like I did that starts from scratch gives you a good window into how people deal with ambiguity in a blank slate and how quickly they're able to pick something up, decide on an idea, and run with it, which is a very important skill in small teams and startups. And if you look in the mirror and you say, wow, I'm a box, that's not a bad thing. I mean, we need boxes too. Those big companies that I'm talking about, where they want to put you into a niche and let you hyper specialize and get really confident in one part of their application stack, those jobs exist and they're really important. And in fact, there's more of those jobs than the jobs that are for wheels. This is more about putting people in places where they're going to be successful. And if you're a box, you really want to avoid smaller teams. And if you're a wheel, you really want to avoid the larger teams because you're going to get really bored, because your forward momentum is often going to be arrested by cumbersome processes and things that those big enterprises have. So the more you're a wheel, the more I encourage you to go towards smaller companies or consulting or contracting work and things like that. And if you're a box, you should be gunning for those big brands, those 1,000 developer teams where you have the structure and support and deliberateness that those companies have that is a higher comfort level for somebody like you. And ultimately, that's what my coding test was trying to figure out. We needed wheels on our team and not boxes. And it did a fantastic job at filtering those applicants through. And the ones that passed it and joined the team ended up being fantastic workers. And we were really successful using that coding test. And again, it wasn't that the other people couldn't hold down a coding job. It's just our environment was not for them. And that's what a true coding test should accomplish for you, as an employer. And if it's not, you should really reevaluate the process. So now that you've heard my story, I want to know in the comments, are you more of a wheel or a box? And now that you're thinking about it, how does that change how you're going to approach job searches and your career overall? Let me know. I'm curious. Happy coding.